March 15, 1945. Standing at 0430 hours, Oberst Wilhelm Richter hunched deeper into the muddy crater as another burst of American artillery screamed overhead. For 3 weeks, his understrength infantry regiment had held this sector against Patton's Third Army, and he believed he had seen everything the Americans could hurl at them. The familiar pattern of heavy preparatory fire, dawn fighter-bomber strikes, then Shermans backed by infantry. His men had learned to survive it since Normandy, but this morning felt wrong. The American guns had fallen silent 10 minutes early. In the dark, Richter could hear a multitude of engines idling, not advancing, and a new metallic clank, like scaffolding being assembled at several points along the enemy line. Feldwebel Klaus Hoffmann crawled in beside him, face ghostly in the pre-dawn gloom. "Sir, the forward observers report odd activity. The Americans are bringing up trucks, ordinary trucks, but they're doing something to them. The observers can't make it out in this light." Trucks, Richter thought, and almost laughed. After all they'd endured, supply lorries at the front seemed almost tame. He raised his binoculars, and what he saw would haunt him. The first rocket launched at 0445, a streak that lit the valley. Then another, and within seconds, 60 rockets screamed aloft. Their keening was unlike anything the defenders had heard. The salvos did not come from classic artillery positions, but from what looked like Sherman tanks, with vast arrays of tubes mounted on their turrets. "Mein Gott," Hoffmann gasped. Before Richter could reply, the rockets hit. The German line detonated in a single, instantaneous saturation. 60 high-explosive warheads in seconds, turning prepared emplacements into chaos. Men hardened by years on the Eastern Front, men who had faced Soviet barrages, froze before this new terror. The sound was the worst. A banshee-like shriek that went right through you, as 19-year-old Hans Müller would later scribble if he survived. The Wehrmacht knew of Nebelwerfer rockets, terrifying, specialized systems requiring trained crews, specific ammunition, and careful emplacement. But these were different. The Americans had not waited for perfect designs. They had bolted launch racks onto ordinary chassis, Shermans that could fight as tanks, and then, in moments, vomit scores of rockets. 2.5-ton trucks converted into mobile salvo platforms. Major Friedrich Köhler, watching through his stereoscopic rangefinder, was an artillery officer schooled in precise weapons development. What he saw overturned every textbook doctrine. It looked like improvisation, patchwork, but it worked, and it worked terrifyingly well. By sunrise, Richter counted a dozen rocket-equipped Shermans and several trucks, firing 36-round salvos. The psychological effect was immediate. Veterans who had faced Katyushas reacted differently when the same hell came from what appeared to be ordinary combat vehicles. Letters one soldier would never send described American production as childlike experimentation. They hang rockets on everything, turn their machines into carnival engines that spit death. In truth, it was American industrial pragmatism. The T-30, the field designation for the rocket Sherman, and simple M8 rockets were not revolutionary individually, but massed in mobile numbers, they produced a shock no doctrinally pure German weapon could match. Lieutenant James Patterson of the 12th Armored later remembered, Germans simply freezing at the first barrage, hardened troops stunned by the noise and by the sight of a regular Sherman launching apocalypse. The German military, built on painstaking specialization, Panzerfeuerfors as tanks, Nebelwerfer as rocket artillery, assault guns for close support, now faced an adversary that assembled capability from common parts and used whatever worked. By March 1945, rockets were appearing on jeeps, half-tracks, even landing craft. Crude, inelegant, and devastating. From his divisional command post, General Major Hans von Kleist could only call it industrial brutality. Components mass-produced and snapped together into new weapons overnight. His staff reported these launchers were fitted at depot level, not in specialized factories, installed in hours, removable when needed, American commanders valuing immediate effect over doctrinal purity. The rockets continued all morning. In one shattered bunker, Hans Müller, still alive and counting the salvos as best he could, watched the cohesion of his unit dissolve. Even seasoned squad leaders abandoned the pretense of control as the new thunder rolled on. The men huddled in whatever cover they could find, flinching with each shrieking barrage. "How many rockets can they possibly have?" someone asked in the darkness of the bunker. "All of them," the squad leader replied bitterly. "They have all the rockets." The American logistics system, incomprehensible in its scale to the German mind, could deliver thousands of rockets to the front daily. While German units carefully rationed their Nebelwerfer ammunition, sometimes having enough for only 1 or 2 salvos per day, American rocket units fired with abandon. A single Calliope could unleash 60 rockets, reload in under 10 minutes, and do it again and again and again. Obus Richter, still alive, but with his regiment combat ineffective, tried to report to division headquarters. The field telephone lines were cut, so he sent a runner. The message was simple, but devastating. Enemy employing new rocket weapon in overwhelming numbers mounted on standard vehicles. Psychological effect on troops severe, cannot hold. The runner, Oberreiter Paul Zimmermann, made it to division headquarters, but found chaos there as well. American rocket-equipped tanks had broken through at multiple points. Staff officers who had served since Poland were fumbling with maps, trying to make sense of reports that seemed impossible. Rocket-firing Shermans, truck-mounted missile systems, even jeeps with rocket tubes. "This must be a mistake," the operations officer insisted. "The Americans don't have specialized rocket vehicles in these numbers. Our intelligence would have known, but intelligence had failed them." The American ability to rapidly produce and field-modify weapons had created a capability gap that German doctrine couldn't account for. While the Wehrmacht spent years perfecting weapons, the Americans spent months mass-producing good-enough solutions. The T-34 Calliope was a perfect example. Was it as accurate as German artillery? No. Was it as sophisticated as the Nebelwerfer? No. But when 60 rockets landed in your position within 10 seconds, accuracy became academic. The psychological trauma alone was worth more than precision. Feldwebel Hoffmann, separated from OS Richter in the chaos, found himself with a mixed group of survivors from various units. They had taken shelter in a destroyed farmhouse, trying to make sense of what had happened to their carefully prepared defensive line. An older soldier, a Stabs Gap fighter from a pioneer battalion, was almost philosophical in his shock. "I helped design the Atlantic Wall fortifications, calculated exactly how much concrete needed to withstand naval bombardment, precise angles for machine gun fields off fire, everything calculated to the millimeter. And the Americans just cover everything with rockets from trucks. The younger soldiers were even more shaken. They had been told repeatedly about German technical superiority, about the V-2 rockets terrorizing London, about jet fighters and super tanks. But here were the Americans turning their standard vehicles into rocket launchers like it was nothing special. One private, barely 18, asked the question they were all thinking. If they can do this with trucks, what else can they do? No one answered. The implications were too terrifying. By noon on March 15th, the German defensive line had essentially ceased to exist. Not destroyed in the traditional military sense, but psychologically shattered. Units that had held against everything the Allies had thrown at them simply dissolved when faced with the screaming rocket barges from seemingly ordinary vehicles. The American advancement was so rapid that they captured several German command posts intact, including General Vaughn's divisional headquarters. The intelligence officer, a Major Thompson, was particularly interested in the German maps and planning documents. "Look at this," he told his colleague, Captain Martinez. "They've got detailed fire plans for their Nebelwerfers, precise calculations, optimal positioning angles, even weather considerations for propellant burn rates. They turned rocket artillery into a science. Martinez laughed. And we just strapped a bunch of tubes to a Sherman and called it a day. That's the difference, Thompson replied, suddenly serious. They perfect weapons. We mass-produce solutions. Among the captured documents was a personal diary belonging to Hedman Schultz, von Klay's aide. His final entry written that morning was telling. The Americans have broken the rules of warfare, not through superior technology, but through the absence of any rules at all. They put rockets on tanks like a child might tie fireworks to a wagon. It should be ridiculous. Instead, it is terrifying. We perfect the art of war. They mass-reduce the tools of victory. The few German units that managed to retreat in good order carried with them stories that seemed impossible to rear area commanders. Rockets from tanks, rockets from trucks, hundreds of them, thousands of them fired with an abandon that suggested unlimited supplies. A staff colonel at Army Group G headquarters initially refused to believe the reports. Propaganda, he declared. Panicked troops exaggerating. The Americans cannot have such weapons in these numbers. But then more reports came in from different sectors, all telling the same story. The American Shad turned rocket artillery from a specialized weapon into a general capability. Any vehicle could become a rocket launcher. Any unit could deliver devastating firepower. The colonel finally accepted the truth when our reconnaissance photograph arrived, showing a column of Shermans, half with the distinctive Calliope rocket, arrays moving toward the German lines. He stared at the image for a long moment, then quietly said, "We have lost." His adjutant was shocked. "Sir, one weapon system cannot." "It's not the weapon," the colonel interrupted. "It's what it represents. We spend years developing the perfect weapon. They spend weeks putting existing weapons together in new ways. We have craftsmen. They have factories. We have doctrine. They have abundance." The psychological impact rippled through the Wehrmacht like a virus. Soldiers who had maintained their fighting spirit through 5 years of war began to question everything. If the Americans could casually turn any vehicle into a devastating rocket platform, what was the point of resistance? Letters home, censored but still revealing, showed the depth of the shock. "My dear wife," one sergeant wrote, "the Americans fight war like they manufacture cars. They take a standard model and add options. Today, rockets, tomorrow, who knows? We cannot compete with this. It is not warfare. It is mass production of death." Another soldier writing to his mother was even more direct. "They say our weapons are superior, but superior to what? The Americans don't even treat weapons as special. They bolt rockets to trucks like farmers adding plows. How do you fight an enemy that treats devastating firepower as casual modification?" The Calliope and its truck-mounted cousins were not wonder weapons in any traditional sense. They were inaccurate compared to tube artillery. The rocket shad dispersion patterns that horrified German artillery officers trained in precision fire. The whole system was unstable. The Calliope made the Sherman top-heavy, difficult to transport, and the rocket tubes blocked the main gun when elevated. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that America could produce them in huge numbers, deploy them instantly, and use them without concern for ammunition expenditure. It was the physical manifestation of American industrial might, crude, overwhelming, and unstoppable. By late March 1945, the psychological damage was complete. German units that had fought tenaciously for years began surrendering at the first sound of rocket salvos. The screaming of the Calliope had become the sound of inevitable defeat. General Lieutenant Otto Heydrich, commanding a corps in the EEF, Sland wrote in his official war diary, "The enemy has achieved moral superiority through material abundance. Our soldiers no longer fight the Americans. They fight the idea of America. Every rocket salvo reminds them that we are a small nation fighting against the industrial output of a continent. Their rockets themselves do less damage than conventional artillery, but they destroy something artillery cannot touch." hope. The truth was that the Calliope was not even particularly successful by American standards. Only about 200 were ever produced, far less than originally planned. The weapon had significant drawbacks that prevented its widespread adoption. Many tank crews preferred to keep their Shermans as traditional tanks rather than deal with the complexities of the rocket system. But the Germans didn't know this. To them, every Kalia sighting suggested thousands more. Every truck-mounted rocket array implied an endless production line of similar weapons. They couldn't conceive that the Americans would develop such weapons in limited numbers. In the German experience, if you went to the trouble of creating a new weapon system, you committed to it fully. The American approach, experimental, iterative, sometimes abandoned as quickly as adopted, was incomprehensible. The T-34 was just one of dozens of rocket launcher variants the Americans tried. T-40 whiz-bang with larger rockets, T-76 with shorter tubes, M-17 mounted on half-tracks. Some worked, some didn't, but all were tried because America could afford to experiment. A captured German intelligence report from April 1945 revealed the depth of their misunderstanding. Enemy rocket artillery capabilities appear unlimited. Conservative estimates suggest thousands of rocket-equipped vehicles. Production capacity must be enormous. Recommend immediate investigation of American manufacturing techniques for post-war application. The reality was that American rocket vehicle production was modest by American standards. But when you could produce 20,000 Sherman tanks, adding rocket launchers to a few hundred seemed trivial. When your truck production numbered in the hundreds of thousands, converting some to rocket launchers was barely worth mentioning in production reports. Onisia Braun, who had survived the initial barrage on March 15th, was captured a week later. During interrogation, his American captors were surprised by his questions. He didn't ask about his fate or the treatment of prisoners. He asked about the rockets. "How many factories do you have making those rocket tanks?" The interrogator, Lieutenant David Cohen, was puzzled. "Factories? You mean depots? We just add the rocket launchers at maintenance depots." Brune stared at him. "Maintenance depots? You mean you don't have specialized factories?" Cohen shrugged. "Why would we need specialized factories? It's just some tubes and an electrical firing system. Any decent mechanic can install it." Braun's face went pale. Any decent mechanic? The Americans treated weapon systems that would have required years of German development as an afternoon modification project. The conversation continued with Braun becoming increasingly agitated as learned more about American production methods. The rockets themselves were simple 4 and 1-2 in models mass-produced in factories that had previously made everything from refrigerators to automobile parts. The launchers were welded together from standard steel tubing. The electrical firing systems were adapted from existing tank equipment. "You must understand," Braun finally said, his English halting but clear. "In Germany, such a weapon would be a national project. Special Development Bureau, dedicated factories, years of testing. You do this like adding a radio to a car." Cohen nodded. "Pretty much. If it works, we make more. If it doesn't, try something else. Try something else." The casual dismissal of failed experiments, the willingness to abandon developments that didn't immediately succeed, the sheer wealth that allowed such waste. It was everything their source-starved Wehrmacht could never be. As March turned to April 1945, the rocket-equipped vehicles became a symbol of American abundance that transcended their military effectiveness. German soldiers began surrendering to any American unit, convinced that resistance was futile against an enemy that could so casually deploy such weapons. A Wehrmacht chaplain, Father Andreas Müller, wrote in his journal, "The men no longer speak of tactics or strategy. They speak only of American rockets and trucks and the endless supplies. They have seen the future, and it is made in Detroit." The reference to Detroit was telling. The Germans had learned that many of the vehicles were products of the same factories that had previously made civilian automobiles. The idea that car factories could be converted to produce military vehicles wasn't surprising, but the scale and speed of conversion was. And the casual addition of weapon systems to these vehicles, ASIF rockets were just another option, like heating or improved suspension, represented our approach to war that German military tradition couldn't accommodate. Private Kurt Wagner, 19 years old, captured in early April, told his interrogators a story that exemplified the German psychological collapse. His unit had been holding a crossroads, well dug in with anti-tank guns and machine gun nests. They had held similar positions for weeks against conventional attacks. Then we heard the sound, Wagner recalled, that screaming like demons. My sergeant, a veteran of Russia, just dropped his weapon and said, "It's over." We all knew what he meant. If they have so many rockets they can waste them on a crossroads, they have already won. The crossroads position was hit by 3 Colia salvos, 80 rockets in 30 seconds. The actual casualties were minimal as the Germans are well dug in, but the psychological effect was total. The entire unit surrendered without firing a shot. By mid-April 1945, American forces were racing through Germany, often facing only token resistance. The rocket vehicles had become legend, their psychological impact far exceeding their tactical value. German soldiers would flee at the sound of any rocket. Convinced that American rocket trucks were hunting them, the reality was that most American units never saw a Calliope or rocket truck. The weapons were relatively rare, temperamental, and often kept in reserve for special operations. But the Germans believed they were everywhere. Every Sherman might be a Calliope. Every truck might unleash rocket hell. The uncertainty was paralyzing. Colonel William Harrison, commanding an armored battalion, noted in his after-action report, "The rocket weapons achieved a psychological victory out of all proportion to their employment. We had 3 Calliopes in the entire division, but the Germans believed we had hundreds. Their fear of our industrial capacity became a weapon more powerful than the rockets themselves." The German High Command tried to counter the psychological impact with propaganda. Leaflets were distributed explaining that the American rocket weapons were crude and inaccurate. Technical briefings emphasized their limitations. Orders were issued forbidding discussion of enemy material superiority, but it was too late. The image of Americans casually bolting rockets onto trucks had shattered something fundamental in the German military psyche. They had always believed that superior training. Doctrine, and when necessary, superior technology would overcome material disadvantages. But what technology could overcome an enemy that treated devastating weapons as minor modifications? In one of the war's ironies, captured German rocket scientists were sometimes asked to evaluate American rocket weapons. Their responses were universally dismissive from a technical standpoint. The rockets were inefficient, the mounting systems crude, the firing mechanisms simplistic. But when pressed about effectiveness, they admitted the weapons had achieved their purpose. Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann, a rocket propellant specialist, put it succinctly, "You Americans built a rocket system a graduate student could design, but you built thousands of them while we were still perfecting the theoretically optimal solution. Your rockets are crude. Our rockets are sophisticated. Your rockets won the war." The final German military communications from the Western Front in April and May 1945 are filled with references to American rocket weapons. Units reported phantom rocket attacks, hearing the screaming of Calliopes that weren't there. The psychological warfare was complete. Field Marshal Albert Kessler, commanding German forces in the West, made a final assessment in late April. "The enemy has not defeated us through superior strategy or tactics. They have simply overwhelmed us with material abundance. They put rockets on trucks because they can. They fire thousands where we would fire dozens. They have made war into mass production, and we cannot compete with the assembly line." On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Among the thousands of German prisoners were veterans who had survived the entire war from Poland to the end. When asked what finally broke their will to fight, many cited the American rocket weapons, not because they were particularly deadly, but because of what they represented. Feldwebel, Klaus Hoffmann, who had survived that first barrage on March 15th, was processed through a prisoner of war camp in France. During his intake interview, he was asked about his combat experience. He had fought in Poland, France, Russia, Italy, and finally Germany. He had faced British commandos, Soviet Guards divisions, American paratroopers. But when asked what weapon he feared most, his answer was immediate. The rocket trucks. Not because they killed more than artillery, but because they showed us we had already lost. Any nation that can put rockets on trucks for fun, that can waste them on minor targets, that can produce them like candy, such a nation cannot be defeated by soldiers. We were fighting against factories, not armies. The Calliope would be withdrawn from service shortly after the war. The rocket trucks were converted back to regular transport vehicles. The entire American rocket artillery experiment of World War II would be largely forgotten, overshadowed by the atomic bomb and other wonder weapons. But for the Germans who faced them in those final weeks of the war, they remained a symbol of American industrial might that was both crude and overwhelming. The image of rockets bolted onto trucks, of Shermans sprouting organ pipe launchers, of every vehicle potentially becoming a devastating weapon, captured something essential about the American way of war. Years later, Ostilhelm Richer, who had survived that morning in the Sland, would write in his memoirs, "We Germans always sought the perfect weapon. The Americans simply sought enough weapons. We built the V-2 rocket that could hit London from the continent. They put smaller rockets on trucks and won the war. There is a lesson there, though I am not sure we have learned it even now." The lesson was simple, but profound. In modern industrial warfare, quantity has a quality all its own. The ability to mass-produce good enough solutions would always defeat the pursuit of perfect weapons. The Calliope, crude and inelegant as it was, had demonstrated this truth in the most visceral way possible. The screaming of those rockets, the sight of ordinary vehicles transformed into terror weapons, the casual abundance of American firepower, all of it combined to create a psychological breaking point for the Wehrmacht. They had not been defeated by superior strategy or tactics. They had been overwhelmed by an enemy that could afford to experiment, to waste, to try anything because they had everything. In the end, the Germans couldn't believe America turned ordinary trucks into rocket artillery. But that disbelief itself was the weapon. It represented a way of thinking about war that was foreign to everything the Wehrmacht understood. And in that gulf of understanding lay defeat. The story of Hermann von Dietrich illustrates the complete psychological collapse. Dietrich commanded an anti-tank battery that had destroyed 17 Allied tanks since D-Day. His men were veterans, skilled in camouflage and ambush tactics. On March 23, 1945, they were positioned near Worms, waiting for the American advance. We heard them before we saw them. Dietrich later recounted that distinctive rumbling of Sherman engines. My gunners were ready. We had excellent fields of fire. Then the first Sherman crested the hill, and I saw the tubes. Dozens of tubes mounted above the turret. A Calliope. Dietrich faced a dilemma. His 88mm guns could easily destroy the Calliope at this range, but he knew what would happen next. The Americans would respond with overwhelming firepower. More rocket tanks, artillery, fighter bombers. His destruction of one rocket tank would bring devastation. I gave the order I never thought I would give, Dietrich admitted. We abandoned the guns and withdrew. Perfectly functional anti-tank guns abandoned because we saw rocket tubes on a Sherman. My gunners, veterans of Normandy and the Bulge, didn't even question the order. We all understood fighting, that thing would only bring more of them. The abandoned guns were found later by advancing American troops, still loaded, perfectly positioned, without a shot fired. The American commander, Major Robert Taylor, couldn't understand it. These were veteran troops with perfect ambush positions. They could have destroyed half our column before we knew what hit us, but they just left. What Taylor didn't realize was that the mere sight of the Calliope had triggered a psychological response that overrode years of training and experience. The Germans weren't running from the weapon itself, but from what it represented, the unlimited American capacity corresponded with overwhelming firepower. The rocket weapons also shattered the Wehrmacht's careful tactical doctrine. German defensive tactics relied on calculated responses, measured ammunition expenditure, and precise fire planning. Every shell had to count. Every rocket from their Nebelwerfers was precious. But the Americans fired rockets like they were celebrating the 4th of July. Oberleutnant Georg Fischer, a staff officer with the remnants of the 116th Panzer Division, tried to make sense of American tactics. Our doctrine says rocket artillery should be masked for decisive moments. The Americans use it for everything. Suppressing a machine gun nest, 60 rockets. Clearing a roadblock, 60 rockets. They even fired rockets at single snipers. It's madness, but madness we cannot answer. The madness had method. American commanders had learned that overwhelming firepower saved American lives. Why send infantry to clear a position when you could saturate it with rockets? The Germans, calculating every expenditure, couldn't comprehend such large S. A captured German training manual from March 1945 showed their attempts to adapt new section on American rocket vehicles. Enemy employs modified tanks and trucks with multiple rocket launchers. Weapons are inaccurate but employed in overwhelming numbers. Psychological effect severe. Recommend immediate withdrawal when rocket vehicles identified to preserve forces for more favorable engagement. The manual essentially admitted defeat. When your official doctrine is to run away from enemy weapons, the war is already lost. The American production statistics, when finally revealed after the war, showed the true scale of the mismatch. While Germany produced about 6,000 Nebelwerfer launchers during the entire war, American factories could produce that many rocket tubes in a month. The M8 rocket, the standard American rocket, saw over 2.5 million units produced. The Germans had no conception such numbers were even possible. General Alaburst Johannes Blasowitz, one of Germany's most senior commanders, made a prescient observation in April 1945. We are not fighting the American army. We are fighting American factories. Every rocket that screams overhead was made by workers who never heard a bomb fall. In factories that run 3 shifts using materials from a continent we cannot touch. How does one fight such an enemy? The psychological impact extended beyond the front lines. German civilians, already traumatized by Allied bombing, now heard stories of American rockets, on trucks, of endless supplies of casual abundance that mocked their years of sacrifice and deprivation. Frau Elisabeth Müller, whose husband was serving in the Wehrmacht, wrote in her diary after receiving his last letter. He writes of American rockets, hundreds of them, fired from trucks and tanks, as if they cost nothing. Meanwhile, we save every nail, every piece of string. The Americans fight a different war than we do. They fight a rich man's war. The class consciousness implicit in that observation was widespread. The German soldier making do with less and less faced Americans who seemed to have unlimited everything. It wasn't just material inequality. It was existential. The German soldier represented a nation's desperate struggle. The American soldier represented an industrial system barely troubled by war. In the prisoner of war camps, German soldiers exchanged stories that grew with each telling. The rocket tanks became monster weapons in their memories. Truck-mounted systems became entire batteries. The psychological trauma transformed modest weapons into mythological terrors. An American psychologist, Captain David Rosenberg, studying German prisoners, noted this phenomenon. They consistently overestimate American rocket vehicle numbers by a factor of 10 or more. When shown photographs proving the actual limited numbers, they refuse to believe them. The psychological impact has created a false memory more powerful than facts. The Germans also couldn't understand the American attitude toward these weapons. German rocket troops were specialists, trained for months understanding every aspect of their weapons. American rocket vehicle operators often learned on the job, treating their weapons with casual familiarity, that shocked German sensibilities. Sergeant Tom Bradley, a Collier operator, exemplified this attitude. Thema Intenance guys bolted this thing on our Sherman in about 3 hours, gave us a quick briefing, basically point and shoot, then said, "Have fun." We figured it out as we went. The Germans we captured couldn't believe we had maybe 2 days of training on it. This casual competence, the ability to master complex weapon systems without extensive specialized training, reflected American mechanical literacy. A nation of car owners and shade tree mechanics could quickly adapt to military technology. The Germans, with their smaller automotive culture, required extensive training for similar tasks. The impact in German morale went beyond the battlefield. Letters home, even heavily censored, revealed the depth of despair. "My dear mother," one soldier wrote, "the Americans are not like us. They do not treasure ammunition or carefully maintain equipment. They use everything once and throw it away. They fire rockets at single soldiers. They are so rich they can afford to be wasteful. We cannot win against such wealth." Another letter from a junior officer to his wife was even more direct. "I have seen the future, and it is American. They put rockets on trucks because they can. They experiment with weapons like children with toys because failure costs them nothing. We are the past, fighting with rules and limitations they don't recognize." The German High Command tried on last propaganda effort, emphasizing the crude nature of American rockets, their inaccuracy, their wasteful employment. But frontline soldiers knew better. Inaccurate rockets that saturated your position were more terrifying than accurate ones that might miss. Feldwebel Karl Richter, no relation to Wilhelm Richter, put it bluntly during interrogation. "You Americans keep saying your rockets aren't accurate, but when 60 of them land in my sector in 10 seconds, accuracy doesn't matter. You've made accuracy irrelevant through volume. That's more terrifying than any precision weapon." The final German military assessments of American rocket vehicles written in the last days of the war are revealing documents. They show an army trying to understand how they had been defeated by weapons they considered technically inferior. One report, signed by a General Dare Artillery, whose name was later redacted, stated, "American rocket artillery represents a new philosophy of warfare. Rather than perfecting individual weapons, they mass-reduce adequate systems and achieve superiority through volume. This approach requires industrial capacity we could never match. Future German military development must consider this lesson." Of course, there would be no future German military development for years, but the lesson was learned by military theorists worldwide. The American approach, crude, massive, and overwhelming, had proven superior to German precision and expertise. The Calliope crews themselves rarely realized the psychological effect they created. To them, it was an awkward, temperamental device that blocked their main gun and made their tank dangerously top-heavy. Many preferred straightforward tank engagements over rocket operations. Private First Class Joseph Martinez, a Calliope loader, later recalled the difference between myth and reality. "The Germans thought we were some kind of elite rocket unit. Truth was, we were just regular tankers stuck with this contraption. Half the time the rockets wouldn't fire right. The wiring kept shorting out. We spent more time fixing it than using it. But the Germans didn't know that. They heard the noise and panicked." This divide between appearance and truth became a weapon in itself. The Germans imagined flawless American technology supported by endless resources. In truth, it was improvisation and rough engineering that made it frightening. It showed America could win without even needing perfection. The rocket vehicles also revealed a deeper difference in military philosophy. The Wehrmacht, heir to Prussian tradition, sought precision and order. Each weapon finely crafted, every plan rehearsed, every soldier expertly trained. The Americans, by contrast, brought industrial realism to the battlefield. Good enough was good enough if it could be built in vast numbers. Major Hans Kruger, captured in April 1945 expressed this during interrogation. "You Americans have destroyed the art of war. There is no art left, only production. You've turned war into factory work. We were soldiers. You are managers in uniform." His bitterness reflected not only defeat, but the collapse of a centuries-old military culture. The final recorded German encounter with Calliope rockets came on May 4, 1945, just 3 days before surrender. A small Wehrmacht detachment defending a bridge near Salzburg reported enemy rocket tanks approaching. Their commander, a Hauptmann whose name is lost to history, sent his last transmission. "Enemy rocket tanks in sight. Will not resist. Germany has suffered enough." They surrendered without firing. The Calliopes they faced weren't even loaded. The crews had run out of rockets days earlier. Yet, the empty launch tubes were enough. The psychological weapon worked, even when the physical one did not. In the post-war years, German officers studied captured American rocket vehicles in detail and were astonished by what they found. The weapons were far cruder than they had imagined. Simple, solid-fuel rockets with basic impact fuses, launch frames welded from standard steel, triggered by rudimentary electrical circuits. Any competent workshop could have built them. Dr. Friedrich Hoffmann, no relation to Feldwebel Klaus Hoffmann, was tasked with evaluating this technology. His technical report was scathing. These weapons would fail every German quality test. The welds are uneven, the wiring primitive, the rockets scatter far beyond acceptable range. Yet they defeated us. We must rethink our entire concept of military engineering. That rethinking would influence weapons design for decades. The true lesson of the Calliope was not about rockets or tanks, but about production philosophy. America had demonstrated that mass and speed could overwhelm precision. For many German veterans, the psychological scars lingered. At a 1965 reunion of former Wehrmacht soldiers, mention of American rocket attacks still provoked uneasy silence. One veteran refused to attend fireworks shows, unable to bear the sound. Another, Helmut Wagner, once explained it to his grandson. "Imagine you train all your life to duel with a sword, and your opponent shows up with a machine gun." That was fighting the Americans. They didn't defeat our skill. They made it meaningless. American veterans had their own, humbler perspective. Many only learned later about the psychological shock they had caused. They saw themselves as ordinary citizen soldiers, doing their best with whatever equipment they had. The idea that their makeshift rockets had shattered enemy morale seemed almost ridiculous. Master Sergeant William Cooper, who commanded a Calliope in 1945, once said, "We figured the Germans would laugh at our setup. Rockets bolted to a tank like some kid's science project. Turns out, it scared the hell out of them. I guess when you can afford to strap rockets on tanks just because you can, that sends a message. And that message was unmistakable. America possessed resources beyond German comprehension. It could experiment, waste, and still prevail through sheer productive capacity." Crude though it was, the Calliope became the perfect emblem of this reality. After the war, analysis confirmed its impact. Units facing rocket-equipped vehicles surrendered 3 times more often than those confronted by standard weapons. Actual casualties were lower than from artillery, but psychological collapse was near total. A U.S. Army report concluded that the Calliope achieved strategic outcomes through tactical use. By breaking morale at the unit level, it accelerated Germany's collapse. The report noted this effect was unintended. The rockets were built for battlefield support, not psychological warfare, but the result was undeniable. The Wehrmacht, which had endured 5 years of brutal conflict, disintegrated not from superior firepower, but from confronting something it couldn't fight. Limitless industrial power. Feldwebel Hoffmann's last diary entry, written in a POW camp, summarized it. They won because they could afford to waste. They could try foolish ideas because They had enough that even foolish ideas worked through numbers. We lost because we couldn't imagine such wealth. We were defeated by abundance disguised as rockets on trucks. The Calliope song became the death knell of the Wehrmacht, not for what it was, but for what it represented. The raw, deafening voice of American industry, unstoppable and crude. In the end, the Germans could not comprehend how their enemy had turned ordinary trucks into rocket artillery. And that disbelief itself became the weapon that broke their will. Years later, Oberst Wilhelm Richter would summarize it simply: "We prepared for everything except this, an enemy who didn't need to be efficient." The Americans won because they could afford waste. In war, as in life, wealth is its own strategy.